Hi there. In this video, we will go over how to properly annotate a poem using an example poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. Now, this is a continuation of our poetry series. In the first video, which I'll link somewhere in the video, we went over how to properly read and analyze a poem. And I thought it'd be useful to kind of go over an example so you can kind of see what goes through my mind while I try annotating it. Full disclosure, I've already read this poem. I've had a couple takes of this video trying to wrap my head around it. So I think in real life, in a real world scenario, it would be a little bit more messy, and you would likely be, using external resources to understand stuff better, whereas I'm kind of going to try doing it all in one take. Okay, so to begin with, the first thing you want to do, so step one, referring back to our previous video, is read the poem. So like I said, I've already done that. And if you haven't, you can feel free to pause the video and read the poem right now. So moving on to step two then is when you want to question things. So this is while your first read through of the poem, and your second one where you might be circling things or highlighting things. When you're questioning things, you want to look up stuff, words you don't understand, things that seem kind of strange in terms of the structure. So for this particular poem, some things that sort of stand out is one, why are the last two lines repeated? Some words that stick out to me are queer, because I know that word means something today, but maybe it meant something differently back then. So I would want to look into that. What else? There was a few words here. Harness. I feel like that word likely has more than one meaning. And so it could be taken in a lot of different contexts. And also Downy. Now, I know Downy is like a toilet or tissue paper brand, but I don't know what that word actually means and how it's being used in this context. So I think that would be also important to look up. Okay, so once you kind of, question things, you kind of go through that step, you want to move on to step three, which is to annotate and look up literary devices in the poem. And so, the first step of that part of annotating, I always think, is to look at the title. The title is really what encapsulates the poem. It's what draws the reader in, and there's clear intention behind a title for most poems, at least. So in this one, it's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. So I already noticed some alliteration there, stopping on a snowy evening. But what the poem does is it already sets an expectation for you. It makes use of imagery where you're stopping by woods and it's a snowy evening. So already it sets a time, it sets a place, and so it kind of primes you to think of certain things before you even read the first line of the poem. So moving on to the first stanza, whose woods these are, I think I know. So there's some alliteration again. Whose woods? These are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. Some more alliteration. Okay, so this stanza stands out in a few ways. First of all, it places you in the woods, which the title had already kind of alluded to. However, I think what's interesting here is, what I want to do is in my previous takes, I didn't make enough notes, but I think it's very important, and it's a key piece of annotating is actually making notes. I think there's a duality here between woods and village. So when you think of woods, you think of foreign, wild, kind of scary, maybe desolate. Whereas village, you think more, civilization, people, comfort, home, stuff like that. So already there's this duality here where our speaker, he or she, we're not too sure, is in the woods, and there's someone who's we don't know who that's referring to, is in the village. and they can't see them. He will not see me stopping here. So they can't see the speaker. So it's already as if you're kind of isolated, you're away from society. To watch his woods fill up with snow. So he's implying that he's not going, or sorry, they are implying that they're not going to stay in the woods very long. Okay, moving on to the second stanza. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. So I want to highlight little horse. So when you think horse, I think, kind of like it's almost a paradox here, because a horse is known as being noble and strong, and think of like horsepower. When you think of like horsepower of a car, it's how strong it is. It's associated with travel. But here, the paradox here is it's a little horse. So it creates almost this expectation that perhaps this horse isn't as strong or as capable of protection as you might think. So that's kind of what I think there. To stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. Frozen is an interesting word. I think it evokes a sense of desolation, opposite of warmth. It's very isolating. It's unsettling, I would say. Between the woods and frozen, and the darkest evening of the year. Is it winter solstice? We know that that's the longest night of the year, but perhaps that's what he's implying. Maybe it's a new moon. It's a very dark night, so potentially putting you, setting a time frame for it as well. Maybe it's winter. Most likely it is if it's snowing. Okay, moving on to the next stanza. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. So that's another example of alliteration there. And I know I'm just pointing out alliteration, but sometimes what you could do is you could take the two words that are alliterative and you can see if there's any connection or further meaning that you can derive from them. For the sake of this video, I won't be going too in-depth in that, but that's always something to keep in mind. I think it's another thing that stood out to me is easy wind. I think that's kind of a unique description of wind. Perhaps it's not too turbulent and it's not stormy outside, but it's easy. It's obstacles aren't too difficult to overcome, is kind of what the impression that I get. But again, these two stanzas, the second and third stanza, they kind of evoke a darkness, a desolation, and a loneliness, where even though you're with your little horse and but it's so dark outside, and it might be a mistake to come out here. So it kind of it sets a mood, which I think it does really well through the use of imagery. So I would say it sets mood via imagery. Okay, and then moving on to the last stanza, which kind of supports my point. The first line says, "The woods are lovely, dark and deep." Again, that's a bit of a oxymoron, maybe, that something is lovely and dark and deep. So despite all of the imagery beforehand that explains that it's dark and scary, it's also lovely. So it's almost like, and if you think of like suffering in life, challenges can be, difficult to overcome, but at the same time, they allow you to grow and potentially move past them. And that kind of builds into the next lines where it says, "But I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep." And miles to go before I sleep. So one of the things that Spark Notes kind of in their analysis was they talked a lot about suicide and how that this poem has some tones which evoke that. that idea. I don't know if I totally agree, but I think there is some merit to that in the sense that, you know, this whole poem is kind of an impasse. It's a detour from whatever trip or journey this speaker is on, and whether that be the journey of life or just a simple trek through the woods, you have to keep going, and you can stop and admire the beauty of, you know, certain things in life or whatever you come across, but ultimately, and it could be scary, right? Challenges that you face, goals that you set, promises of a better tomorrow, but you can't just stop in your tracks, and you can't just sleep. Sleep being whether it's just a rest or whether it be dying. You have to keep going, and because you have promises to keep and you have things to do. Yeah, and so I think ultimately that's my analysis of this poem, is kind of taking the imagery that's given to you and the repetition of the last two lines, which really emphasizes this, that there's still more to come. I think ultimately is what Frost was trying to get across, is this sense of not giving up and just moving forward. Yeah, and I think that's pretty much it. Hey all, editing Vishal here. So one major point that I forgot to point out that really is one of the first steps you want to take when annotating a poem is to look at the rhyme structure of the poem. So in this poem in particular, it's actually has a pretty interesting rhyme structure. So it's throughout the poem, it's A, A, B, A, 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 B, A, 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 B, A, and then this script is completely flipped in the last stanza, and it's A, 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 with the last two being repeats. Repeated line, repeated rhyme, and yeah, ultimately, it's important to keep track of this because, kind of like I had mentioned throughout the video, is this last stanza really kind of ties it together, and it allows the reader to have this sort of cathartic moment and realize that stopping by woods on a snowy evening means a bit more than you might think on the surface level. All right. So I'll let the rest of the video run now. And yeah, I just wanted to point that out. All right. Bye-bye. And I want to point out, of course, poetry is subjective and there's a lot of different ways you can look at things. And this by no means was a complete annotation. It was pretty piecemeal and somewhat disorganized, but I hope I was able to convey a general sense of how you want to go about doing an annotation. I think in a real world or an assignment or whatever, you want to be a lot more detailed and write a lot more than I did. I rambled a bit more than actually writing stuff, but yeah, but this allows you to have a more concise understanding of the elements of the poem, which ultimately gives you a sense of what the poem might be about, and you can allow you to analyze it further. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. Please comment, like, and subscribe. If you have any suggestions for future videos or other poems I can annotate, that would be much appreciated. See you in the next one. Take care. Bye.